In the 17th century, the contours of the future world were still blurred, like a watercolor on wet paper. The Spanish hegemony, forged from the gold of the Incas and the silver of the Aztecs, was beginning to show the first cracks under its own weight. France, torn apart by internal wars, was only dreaming of greatness. And England, a damp island on the outskirts of Europe, looked upon the world with greed, seeking not glory, but profit. It was an age of gods and monsters. And Europe wanted to be both. The facade of this world shone with magnificence. Royal courts were drowning in silks and velvets brought from the east. World maps were adorned with new lands discovered by brave seafarers, whose ships were symbols of the triumph of Christian civilization. Philosophers debated the freedom and dignity of man, while armies slaughtered the defiant in the name of their monarchs. This was a world confident in its right to rule. In its right to take whatever it desired. But beneath the gilding of this facade, at the very core of the European dream of domination, lay a strange, almost imperceptible vulnerability. It was not an enemy fleet or an empty treasury. It was a desire. A simple, animalistic desire for sweetness. Sugar. In those days, it was not a product. It was a treasure. White crystals, brought from distant lands, were worth more than spices and sold in apothecaries as a miracle cure. It was kept in locked chests, served at the table only on the grandest of holidays. It was a symbol of status, a grain of paradise on a monarch's tongue. To possess sugar was to possess power. But the tectonic plates of history were already in motion. The great geographical discoveries and the birth of the first trading empires created a new class of people, merchants, bankers, shipowners. They had money, but no titles. And they wanted to imitate the aristocracy. They wanted to drink sweetened tea, eat candied fruits, and treat their guests to sweet desserts. Demand, suppressed for centuries, began to seep through all social barriers. It was transforming from a whim into a necessity. And here, the crack in the foundation was exposed. The old sources of sugar, Cyprus, Sicily, Madeira, were a drop in the ocean of a growing appetite. The Ottoman Empire controlled the trade routes, driving prices to the heavens. Europe, which considered itself the master of the world, found itself in a humiliating dependence on the whims of its enemies in a matter that was rapidly turning from a luxury into an economic imperative. The first event that forced this crack to widen was the establishment of English and French colonies in the Caribbean. On the islands of Barbados, Jamaica, and Saint-Domingue, they found no gold. There was no mythical El Dorado. But there was a perfect climate. Perfect soil for growing sugarcane. In the offices of London and Paris, hunched over maps, someone made a simple calculation. A calculation that would change the world forever. They realized that the real gold was not the yellow metal. It is white. And it grows from the earth. The hidden problem erupted, turning into a fever. A sugar rush. It swept through Amsterdam, London, Bordeaux. Anyone with money and without a conscience saw the Caribbean islands as a new frontier, a machine for printing money. The foundation of the old European economy, based on land and craft, began to tremble. In its place came a new order, built on global trade and ruthless exploitation. The first step, as always, was taken with an air of nobility. To solve the labor shortage on the plantations, the Europeans resorted to a system of indentured servitude. The poor, debtors, and petty criminals from England, Ireland, and France were persuaded to sign contracts for several years of work in exchange for passage to the New World and a piece of land at the end of their term. It looked like a compromise. A humane solution to an economic problem. A little blood. But the tropical paradise quickly bared its teeth. The heat, diseases, and inhuman working conditions decimated the white laborers by the thousands. They died of malaria and yellow fever. They rebelled. They ran away. And most importantly, at the end of their contracts, they became free, demanding the promised land. They became competitors. The system was inefficient. It could not satisfy Europe's all-consuming hunger. The rivals were not sleeping. The Dutch, masters of shipbuilding and finance, were the first to smell blood. They already had experience with Portuguese plantations in Brazil and understood perfectly well that indentured servants were a half measure. They knew where to find a real, inexhaustible labor force. They began to offer English and French planters a new commodity. A commodity that required no pay, could not leave, and belonged to its master forever. The pride and self-confidence of European leaders made them believe they were in control of the situation. They saw themselves as architects of a new era, not hostages to rising demand. They spoke of a civilizing mission while their agents in the ports of Bristol and Nantes counted future profits. They failed to notice how a sweet whim had turned into an ultimatum. An economic ultimatum delivered to them by history itself. The planetary mechanism that would later be called the triangular trade slowly gained momentum. Ships left Europe with cargoes of weapons, cheap textiles, and trinkets. In Africa, this cargo was exchanged for living goods. Then, the holds, packed with despair, crossed the Atlantic. And back to Europe, the ships carried barrels of raw sugar, molasses, and rum. It was a perfect, closed loop. And at its center was not man. At its center was capital. The first crack had become an abyss. The attempt to solve the problem with a little blood had failed. Now, what was at stake was not just profit, but economic hegemony. And to win this race, a step had to be taken from which there was no turning back. The moment of truth arrived. It did not come with the thunder of cannons or an ultimatum from an enemy ambassador. It came with the quiet scratch of quills in accounting ledgers and the cold gleam in the eyes of planters. The choice was simple and terrible. Either admit the Caribbean project was a failure, cede to the Dutch and Portuguese, and remain on the periphery of the New World economy. Or make a deal with the devil. And the deal was made. It was not a single decision by one king or parliament. It was a collective, creeping acceptance of the inevitable. It was the surrender of the remnants of morality to the logic of profit. The price of survival in the new economic race was the creation of the most brutal and efficient system of forced labor that humanity had ever known. The deal with the devil was the full, unconditional, and industrial implementation of African slavery. It was no longer a byproduct of wars or piracy. It became the foundation. The engine. The fuel of the new economy. Laws were rewritten. A human being was officially turned into a thing, into property, into a talking tool. The Church, which only yesterday had spoken of the soul of every creature, found theological justifications. The philosophers who had celebrated freedom declared entire races inferior, created for subordination. The foundation of the empire, which had been crumbling, was now poured with concrete mixed with blood and sugar. The Caribbean islands were transformed into hell on earth. The life of a slave on a sugar plantation was short and full of suffering. From dawn until dusk, under the scorching sun and the whip of the overseer, people worked to the point of utter exhaustion. The average life expectancy after arrival on a plantation was 7 years. 7 years of inhuman labor so that Europe could drink sweet tea. The planters quickly calculated, it was cheaper to bring a new slave from Africa than to create conditions for an old one to survive. It was ruthless mathematics. Nothing personal. Just business. It was the triumph of the system. Sugar flooded into Europe. Prices fell. What had been the luxury of kings became available to every dockworker. The ports of Bristol, Liverpool, Nantes, and Bordeaux grew obscenely wealthy. Magnificent mansions were built, universities and works of art were sponsored with blood money. The Industrial Revolution, which changed the face of England and the world, was nourished by capital born on the bones of slaves. This was the price of survival. Europe did not just survive the race. It became the hegemon. But it sold its soul. The humiliation was not in a treaty with an enemy, but in a pact with its own greed. By saving their economic model in the short term, the European nations planted a time bomb under their own future: racial hatred, colonial guilt, and a demographic catastrophe whose echo can still be heard today. The point of no return had been crossed. The flywheel of history was spinning, and it was now impossible to stop. The world was changed forever. The British Empire, on which the sun never set, was built not on principles of liberty, but on a foundation of sugarcane and human bones. The navy that ruled the seas protected not so much the shores of England as the trade routes through which the white gold flowed. London became the financial center of the world because its bankers learned how to extract profit from suffering better than anyone else. Hegemony was achieved. For the losers, the retribution was total. Africa was devastated. Millions of the healthiest and youngest people were torn from their homeland, leading to a century of stagnation and endless wars. The Caribbean islands, once paradises, were turned into monoculture death factories with ravaged ecosystems and societies built on fear and hatred. This was not a tragedy. In the ruthless world of realpolitik, it was a logical outcome. The weak become a resource for the strong. The gilded facade with which we began finally collapsed. Behind the elegant tea parties in English drawing rooms, behind the enlightened conversations in Parisian salons, a shadow now loomed forever, the shadow of a slave ship's crowded hold. But history loves irony. In the 19th century, slavery was abolished. Not because of a sudden moral epiphany, but because the system had become economically inefficient. New sources of sugar and new technologies had emerged. The machine built on slavery had become obsolete. But the craving that birthed it never disappeared. It merely took on a new form. Today, sugar is not a luxury or a medicine. It is everywhere. Hidden in every product on the supermarket shelf. Cheap, accessible, addictive. Empires no longer fight for it with cannons and ships. They fight for market share with marketing and lobbying. The echo of that deal with the devil resounds today, but now it is inside us. The epidemic of obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease is the modern form of slavery. A slavery to our own desires, artfully stoked by corporations. The sweet death that once claimed lives on the plantations now does so slowly, invisibly, in hospital wards around the world. The empire of sugar did not fall. It merely changed its colonies. Now, its colony is you.